Community radio is a grassroots institution that underpins our freedom of speech, which is so central to our democracy. In the Northern Territory, as in other regional, rural and remote areas, it's the heart of local communities and the essential way that people learn about what's going on and the way that people connect with others. And sometimes it's the only way to connect. And that's particularly true of emergencies when people are so dependent on radio for information. But in all cases, it fosters that sense of real connection. It helps people to share local news, stories, voices and music. It celebrates the best of our diverse and multicultural society. And every week, 5 million listeners tune into 450 community-owned and operated radio stations around the country. Now that is massive, Deputy Speaker, when you consider that Sydney's 2GB, which is popular and with some and influential, gets about 600,000 listeners a week. Community radio gets almost 10 times that audience. Community radio is especially significant for 1.4 million listeners who are from non-English speaking backgrounds who listen to broadcasts in over 100 languages. And that's why I'm so very proud that on 13th of May this year, the Australian Labor Party committed to give the community broadcasting sector greater funding certainty. Now, that was, of course, prior to the election. Now the ALP is in government and will deliver. That's exactly what we've done here, Deputy Speaker. The government is giving the community broadcasting program an extra $4 million a year in ongoing funding, which will take annual funding to over $20 million per year. We're also reviewing the long-term sustainability of the sector to help it thrive and endure into the future, and that is what this bill is all about. We're going to make the renewal process for community radio licences a non-competitive process to cut the red tape for operators, and that means that the regulator, ACMA, will prioritise the current operator's renewal application over a proposed new radio service. And this will give certainty to those existing licensees while allowing ACMA to refuse to renew a licence if the licensee's radio service is not meeting community needs. They'll need to be held accountable to their communities. We want listeners around Australia to have continued access to high quality and locally relevant news. Community broadcasters faced uncertainty under the former coalition government, which ignored their calls for stability and funding. And after all, that community radio broadcaster had done for Australians through the bushfires, the floods, through COVID, the pandemic, all they got from the former coalition government was a big shrug. The former government ignored the sector's calls for COVID crisis funding during the pandemic. I'm happy to be corrected, but I'm informed that that is the case, and that is pretty deplorable. They ignored their calls for sustainable future funding. Anyone would think that they didn't want to hear the voices of Australian people in places like the Northern Territory, where they didn't want people, perhaps marginalised people, perhaps people that needed a voice, perhaps First Nations people that needed a voice, asked for a voice, want a voice. But they've been ignored because others know better. And in this case, instead of granting the usual 4-year top-up funding, the coalition only gave the sector 2 years, which was due to run out next year. And the committed funding was due to drop to around $17 million per year over the forward estimate. So real cuts in the funding for community radio. But why, Deputy Speaker, were they cutting funding from this vital sector that their own members have just said is so important to the cohesion of their community? Why were they doing it? It's hard to reconcile why any political organisation would seek to cut the voices of Australian people. Community radio exists precisely so that they have a voice and assist them in being heard and celebrating their connection as part of our multicultural community. Our government, the Labor government's budget commitment, will maintain community broadcasting funding so that the sector can continue to support communities with local news, emergency broadcasting, so important all around the country. But that's true of the Northern Territory, the top end, as we go into cyclone season. But also local content, celebrating those local voices, Australian music, which is so important. In my electorate of Darwin and Palmerston, we have high quality and much loved stations such as Territory FM 104.1, which is an amazing station. It's a broadcast of our Charles Darwin University campus. And on a Sunday night, they have a wonderful program where different multicultural organisations get to talk to people in their language, get to celebrate things that are happening in the community, but get to make sure that the members of that multicultural community are heard and understand what government through broadcasting is saying, what subject matter experts through local community radio is being the vehicle for information, important information, sometimes life-saving information to get to the community. So hats off to Territory FM. A survey in 2016 found that it reached 51% of all people in Darwin and has very much been listened to widely over the years. It was actually rated in September #1 radio station in Darwin overall for the 40 to 65 years old demographic. Darwin's 97.7 is a Christian community radio station that's doing great work in Darwin and Palmerston, but also their reach extends past Humpty Doo. Then we have First Nations Radio 94.5, which is formerly Radio Larrakia, which is an Aboriginal community radio station broadcasting from Darwin that reaches the township of Jabiru out in Kakadu. It provides a great service and they're a culturally appropriate broadcaster. They observe Aboriginal cultural protocols and underpin everything they do. And I think a lot of people will be hearing on First Nations Radio about the developments around who's supporting a voice for First Nations people down here and who is not. For people in Arnhem Land, Yongle Radio, other stations that have Creole language provide that service so that people in the remotest areas of the Territory, including the homelands, can hear what's going on. But also want to give a shout out to Tiba and also to Karma Radio in Alice Springs, Catherine FM and Gove FM, who all keep their communities connected and informed. I want to give a big shout out to all of those community radio stations and those that I might have missed in the Northern Territory who are every day making sure Territorians, whether you're a First Nations Territorian, whether you've just arrived from overseas, making sure that they're understood. That's why it's so important that we protect and develop our community radio station speaker. They truly are the heart of communities across our country and we support them very much on this side of the House. Thanks, Mr.